Hello everyone, and welcome to the first installment in my video series showcasing Meiou and Taxes 2.0, also known as the Population Overhaul. I'm Demian Sky. MNT 2.0 is still an alpha, but enough of the mod has been completed for us to show you some of the basic core features. Before we dive in though, I thought I'd just mention the overarching philosophy of the various changes and why we made them. Now, we're really hoping that MNT 2.0 will fill in one of the great gaps that has always existed in the Europa Universalis series. In EU4, nations can rise and fall on a grand scale, yeah, but the land itself upon which those nations exists, they remain almost entirely static. You can sack Paris like 50 times, but no matter how much you abuse it, Paris still remains the cultural urban center of Europe. What's more, you can build a vast colonial empire with Dublin as your capital, but Dublin too remains inert despite its rise in fortunes. The Common Sense DLC tried to remedy this situation, I think, by giving players the chance to summon developments with magical monarch points, but at least to me, this only really made the world feel less alive than it did before. And so really, that is the main objective for Meiou and Taxes 2.0. We don't want to just generate the illusion that the world is alive. We want the world to actually be alive. Rather than abstracted development scores, the game will be filled with populations that grow and flourish when nurtured, perish when abused, and go seeking new land when their conditions become too perilous. Based on a multitude of conditions, cities will grow in prominence as they become centers of production, culture, and trade, and they can decline into irrelevancy when the conditions which made them great to begin with disappear. Every province has a local, growing economy and local wealth, and the money that flows into your treasuries is ultimately contingent on the health and well-being of your country's economy as a whole. So, let's get down to business. We've called MNT 2.0 the Population Overhaul for an obvious reason. We've removed the old abstracted development scores of base tax, production, and manpower, and we've instead replaced them with 3 different types of literal population values. Each population unit in the province interface represents 10,000 people. Some provinces have just a few thousand residents, as you can see here on the island of Man, while other provinces have hundreds of thousands or even as high as 1 million people living there. Team member Alderon has spent the past 6 months researching post-Black Death demographic data for all of the thousands of provinces in-game, so the attention to detail of the Pop Overhaul is quite staggering. The Island of Man and head over to a province which isn't sparsely populated, Paris. We can see here that Paris has a total of 49 pops, which translates to 490,000 residents in the province. I'll describe in detail later on what the various pops mean, but for now, let's take a quick walking tour of the globe to see what population density and distribution looks like around the world. For this purpose, we can go ahead and take a look at vanilla EU4 development map mode, and we'll go into observation mode as well. We can see here that red and orange represent lackluster population density, and the quick survey of Europe shows that it isn't terribly populated in this era of history. Part of the reason, of course, is that the Black Death just steamrolled through, and that basically wiped out half the population. You can see that the British Isles are a bit sparse, along with the Iberian Peninsula. France is by far the juggernaut when it comes to population in Europe, especially in northern France around Paris, and down south in Languedoc around Toulouse. Northern Italy has a decent population as well, especially around the city of Milan and Piedmont. Germany and Eastern Europe are both rather sparse too at game start, except around Bohemia. And we can see over in the Middle East, the Levant and Egypt have some bright spots, especially along the Nile River. Also, even though the Arabian Peninsula is mostly a desert wasteland, you can see Yemen is actually an impressive little bastion of humanity. So, now here in Mesopotamia we have an interesting case. Just a century ago, before the start of the game, Mesopotamia was a titan when it came to population, and always has been historically, actually. Just the city of Baghdad alone had 1 million people living there. As far as historical inertia is concerned, this region really should look much more like Egypt and much less like the Balkans. However, decimation by the Mongols and then the Black Death left Mesopotamia a shadow of its once glorious self. However, the Population Overhaul has assigned special variables to every province in the game, which tracks a province's underlying population potential. So even though 90% of the population of Mesopotamia had been destroyed in the past 100 years, if a savvy player is able to keep this region peaceful and nurture it back to health, it is possible to restore Mesopotamia to its historic potential as the behemoth of the Middle East. While this never happened in history because Mesopotamia was basically used as a war zone for the next 500 years, EU4 is a game about alternate history, so who knows? So anyway, let's continue on our journey. Persia isn't terribly densely populated, but as we get to India, we see lots of green, lots and lots of people. In the same way that the Indian subcontinent today has more people living there than all of Europe and the Mediterranean combined, so too is this the case in this era of history. When we hop over to China, we see a similar picture. Lots and lots of green, lots and lots of people. So, now a lot of you are probably saying, oh my god, China and India are so strong. How did they not conquer the world? How is this game possibly going to be balanced with these two superpowers? Well, let's just say there is a big fat missing ingredient that the gross population map does not account for. To elucidate, let's head back to Western Europe. Alright, so back we go, and here we are in modern-day Spain. And as you can see, the Iberian Peninsula isn't the most populous place in the world. However, looks can be deceiving. It's not all about just gross population. So let's go ahead and jump into Granada, the last bastion of Islam on the peninsula. So again, we can see not super populated. But then, when we turn on the special pop overhaul map mode, we see a different portrait. Okay, so as an aside, we do not have the modding tools to change any of the map modes. However, that doesn't mean we couldn't find a way to hack the game to make our own map mode. So, what we did was use the underlying data generated by the pop overhaul to display icons in the trade map mode. That's what we're basically looking at here. This particular part of the map mode is a graphical representation of urbanization percentage by region. The greener the icon on a province, the better the urbanization of that region. The redder the icon, the worse. And of course, urbanization represents how many people are living in the city versus the countryside. And we can see here that even though the Emirate of Granada has a relatively mediocre population size, it is highly, highly urbanized. And this has profound consequences. As we will discuss later, people living in cities are substantially more potent than people living in rural areas. City folk are more productive, they dominate trade, and also drive lots of innovation. So let's take another walking tour, but this time of urbanization in Europe and the world at large. We can see that even though France was very densely populated, its urbanization is actually kind of lackluster. The British Isles are rather pathetic, probably history's way of retroactively punishing them for leaving the European Union. Over in Flanders and Holland, we see very impressive urbanization. Germany is a bit lackluster at game start, with the exception of maybe Swabia and Westphalia. And of course, Poland and Lithuania in this period are really quite remote. But when we take a look down in Italy, it becomes quite apparent why it was the center of the Renaissance. There is substantial urbanization throughout the peninsula, and especially down in Sicily, which historically has always had a fairly robust agricultural presence as well as substantial urbanization. And Greece had decent urbanization in this era, much of which is really driven by Thessalonica and Athens. Constantinople is in a pretty sorry state at this point in history, so urbanization in Anatolia is a bit ho-hum. Now, of course, as we head over to Egypt and the Levant, we can see that there's a decent amount of urbanization, especially given how high the base population is. And of course, the reason why urbanization is so large in Egypt really is because Cairo at game start is the largest city in the Western world, with a population of 350,000 people just living in the city. So that definitely tends to skew the percentage of urbanization a bit high in Egypt along the Nile. So as we head through the Middle East, we notice that Persia is a bit of a bright spot, which makes sense, given that the Persians have always been quite advanced since the days of antiquities. Sadly, though, this is just a few years after Tamerlane rolls through and massacres just about every living man, woman, child, and goat. This chain of events will be repeated in game most of the time, but as is the case with Mesopotamia, you will be able to resist the tide of history as a player and perhaps raise Persia to the glory it was always meant to have. And so now let's switch back to the gross population map mode and take a look at India again. They look immensely powerful on the surface if you look at population numbers alone, but when we switch to the urbanization map mode, when we compare rural population and urban population, India's urbanization is virtually non-existent, as you can see. So we can see that there are a few decent cities like Delhi in India, but those few urban outliers are completely drowned out by the stupendous number of rural peasants who live out in the countryside. So what this means in gameplay terms is that places like India leave a pretty big imprint on the world, but because urban societies are vastly more productive and more inventive and advanced technologically more quickly, India can very easily fall behind in the Great Race because they are so utterly devoid of cities. When we head over to China, we see a picture that is just about as bleak. In 1356, China's gross wealth is stupendous and unrivaled in all the world. The three biggest cities, in fact, in the world are all in China. The problem is, of course, that when you average those few large metropoles into a rural population that is 20 times bigger, you end up with a per capita urbanization which is actually really quite mediocre. So yeah, Beijing, Nanjing, and Hangzhou may have 1.5 million people living in opulence and abundance, but hundreds of millions of dirt-eating peasants are living in the countryside, artificially supporting the lifestyle of those living in the few big cities. What's more, the nature of those big cities in China are very different than, say, cities like Venice or Florence or Granada. Chinese cities didn't grow so big as a result of commerce and manufacturing and things of that nature, but largely as bureaucratic centers of a very large empire. Cities like Venice, Florence, and Granada grew large as a result of almost exclusively commerce and industry, and we'll explain why that is so critical later on. So, now that we've finished up our urbanization walking tour, let's get into some of the nitty-gritty details about the various categories of populations. We can head over to England and take a look at Essex. We can see up in the province view the three major types of populations here. Now, it's important to recognize that all populations are by no means created equal. At the bottom of the food chain, as God intended, is the rural peasantry. These are your farmers, plantation workers, miners, and the like. And unless you've built up some pretty strong rural industries in that province, the rural populations generally don't give you very much. But because in most countries they compose a vast multitude of people, they will generally be the foundation of most countries. Next, we have urban population. Urban pops generate more tax income than your peasantry, and they also tend to be the dominant force that moves trade. While basically better than their rural counterparts, urbanization of a province is a long and protracted process. And because urban populations by their very nature aggregate in one place, they tend to be more vulnerable to calamities. And because urban populations tend to sit on much bigger piles of ducats than rural populations, they also tend to be bigger targets in an era when a lot of people went off to war to get themselves some booty. More on this later in videos to come. So then we have our upper class population. Upper class populations play a very different role than your other pops. They, after all, tend to be where most of your country's private wealth flows to, just like God also intended. An uncooperative and decadent upper class can be a drag on your society and a stumbling block to your government, but if they are formidable and well-educated and cooperative, they can play a very positive role in the country's education level and also the competency of your military leadership, among other things. So representing literal historical population numbers in game wouldn't mean very much if these populations didn't react to the world around them. I won't get into too much detail in the first video, but a great deal of the work that's gone into the overhaul involves making these populations grow and decline and move around and seek wealth. This involves creating a complex logistical growth model based on well-established principles of population biology. In fact, most of my time so far has been spent on this particular task. In order to generate plausible outcomes, this model needs to take into account a broad range of variables. To put it simply, populations that have the good fortune of experiencing things like freedom from war, high stability, undisturbed prosperity, good weather, and good governance will flourish. Populations who are, on the other hand, racked by war, famine, and plague will suffer. Historically plausible population growth is maintained by a system of checks and balances, all of which are designed to resist extremes. The higher the province's population grows above its historic potential, the harder and harder it gets to grow further. So in other words, a province in Iceland is never, ever, ever, ever going to be as big as a province in the Nile Delta. So anyway, that's it for now. We've barely just scratched the surface, so stay tuned for more videos previewing M&T 2.0. Thanks.